Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. On this day, we mark 15 years since the joint statement on the India-US nuclear deal, seen as affecting a major transformation in the India-US relationship. I have with me Shivshankar Menon, former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor, to talk about this issue so many years down the line. So, would you describe this joint statement, this nuclear deal as such, as the bedrock of the India-US relationship today?
I I think the bedrock of the relationship is our common interest, is the congruence in interest between India and the US today. But I think that what the deal did, what the nuclear deal did, was to make it possible for us to actually act on our interests, on our common interests, and to transform the relationship. Because this actually removed a huge millstone which had soured the relationship for several years. I mean, after the US, after the 1974 Pokhran test, when the US stopped supplying fuel for Tarapur, and both sides then accused each other of not keeping their word and so on. And the relationship had been embittered. So we needed something to show that we could work together, even in difficult, sensitive areas. And I think this was it.
But what actually triggered this? Was it perhaps the US? This was around the time when the AQ Khan network was unraveling. Would you say that perhaps things like this may have even pushed the US to look at India as as something, as not as an adversary, and this provided an opportunity?
Well, my opinion, because I wasn't involved actually in 2005. I was in Pakistan at that time. It's Shamsaran who did the negotiation of the joint statement, and I got involved later when we were doing the 123, actually implementing, what was agreed between President Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. But my impression is that not only had the world changed, but both sides had already started working together, saw an interest in working together, and the Bush administration especially had come to power after saying in public, in an article in Foreign Affairs by Condoleezza Rice, who was National Security Advisor, later became Secretary of State, that the US saw the rise of India as being in the US strategic interest. And that, I think, was the basis on which, from the US side at least, from our point of view, we now were in the process of trying to transform India. We had started radical reform in the 90s. Under Mr. Vajpayee, who had described the US as a natural ally, we had started cooperating in defense. The US was an essential partner in a whole series of issues, especially in our own transformation. And there was economic complementarity, but there was also political complementarity. And therefore, it was logical that both sides were looking for a way of showing their own people and the world that they could deal with the difficult issues between them and move on and transform the relationship. And I think this was the perfect symbol of that.
It's interesting that in all these years, we haven't bought a single American reactor.
Well, there were three things that we said when we were negotiating it. I think it was important for us to clear the nuclear issue, get it off the table, deal with it. But we also said that, frankly, whatever we bought had to be competitive with other reactors. It had to be also competitive with other sources of energy. It had to be safe, meaning it had to be certified by their own regulatory agencies, in the US case, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in our case, in those days, the AERB, and that therefore it had to be competitive. It couldn't be just that, we would buy it because it was a US reactor. The US hasn't built a reactor, a new power reactor at home for a very long time, hasn't actually certified one themselves. And, US companies also have gone through various restructurings. Westinghouse, their nuclear wing, Toshiba took over part of it, etc. So, frankly, that's a discussion which still goes on desultorily. But when we had approached the end of it, when it was about to go through Congress in 2008, President Bush gave a small dinner for a few people who were involved in this for Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and there must have been 8 or 10 of us at the table. And I think it was Condoleezza Rice who leaned across the table and asked Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, "So when are you buying a US reactor?" And President Bush immediately cut her off and said it was never about selling reactors. It was about the relationship.
But the fact that
didn't have to answer the question at all. But that was the motivating factor, not how much money are we going to make, or on both sides. I think there was a larger conception of why we were doing this.
So this was genuinely a strategic effort to transform the relationship.
I think that's what it was, and by those standards, it succeeded. Because US relations today, 15 years later, are probably better than they ever have been before.
True. The fact that the Russians, ironically, are the only ones to benefit from this deal.
Well, the Russians,
the US did all the heavy
for the deal. Kudankulam 1 and 2, we had signed for even before the nuclear deal and before we went to the NSG. This had been grandfathered actually already. So those negotiations we had actually begun in the 80s with Russia or the Soviet Union in those days. And so we had actually, that part of it we had done earlier. We were also negotiating with the French. I'm not sure where that is now.
Does it ever rankle with the Americans? This fact that the Russians, their adversaries, have made the most of the deal?
I don't think the Russians made the most of the deal. The Russians had already sold us reactors, and they have continued to sell us power reactors. I'm not sure. I don't know whether it rankled. Frankly, if they're competitive, I'm sure they think about it. But I don't think it's a big issue for them. As I said, if this wasn't driven by commercial considerations, so if it wasn't, then it's something that I don't think this should rankle.
In your sense, have we leveraged the nuclear deal well? Have we taken full advantage of it?
Have India-US relations grown the way we expected? The world changed. I mean, many things happened after that. Soon after the deal, Fukushima happened, for instance. When we did the deal, the general expectation, not just in the IAEA where you would expect it, but even in the US, elsewhere, if you look at it, was that we were on the verge, the world was on the verge of a second nuclear revolution, another wave of building power plants, partly because it was an answer to climate change. It was a clean form of energy, and because the environment had become an issue across the world. But then Fukushima happened. So there were doubts about safety, public acceptance became an issue. And in most societies also, in many of the Western societies, the economics shifted, partly because shale oil came, oil prices came down, suddenly fossil fuels were cheap and available again. So actually the economics shifted, public perception of safety and so on shifted. So the global market actually changed in a sense. But more than that, I think if you look at many of the earlier estimates of energy needs around the world, much of that also changed. And today, of course, we're in a whole new situation.
It's been talked about that the US was also looking at China's rise way back. And in that sense, some of the motivation for the deal may have also been triggered by China's rise.
It could
What is your sense?
It could well be that this was part of a US attempt to create a sort of balanced situation in Asia. Maybe. But frankly, the US at that stage had a very close relationship with China. And this became apparent the year we concluded the deal in 2008 when the global financial crisis struck. And both the US and China worked very closely together to ensure that the value of the dollar stayed high, that further shocks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the stock market crash that further shocks were minimized, because after all, the Chinese had 80% of their reserves in US dollars, more than 80%. If you read Hank Paulson's book, he has an account how every day in the morning they used to coordinate with each other to see that there were no economic shocks to the market on both sides, and that they actually went through the crisis. And they were tied economically. If you look at the political record of voting in the UN, for instance, I mean, I saw some figures yesterday that from 2000 to 2018, there was something like 197 votes in the Security Council. China voted with the US in 182 of them. That's an amazing congruence. I mean, if you think of it, I don't think we quite realize how close and intimate their relationship was. Yes, they might have looked for balancing, because it always keeps people more honest. But they had huge stakes in that relationship with China. And I don't think this is a binary choice for us as well. We have had big stakes in the relationship with China. China was our biggest, trading partner for many years. Now the US has overtaken, if you add services, but on goods, they're still our biggest trading partner. They have invested $26 billion in the Indian economy in the last 6 years. So actually, both of us have stakes in that relationship with China. Some of it is competitive, some of it may be even adversarial, I mean, could be. But there is also a whole cooperative ballast to those relationships. So it's not just a straightforward, let's do a nuclear deal to balance China. I don't see it. I think it's a much more complicated, variegated game.
The fact that we are not in the nuclear suppliers group, is that a major issue anymore? Is it still something which we are?
I actually think this is the best position you could be in. You have an exemption. You can do everything a member can do. You can cooperate with everyone. In fact, you have a special exemption for yourself. And you don't have the responsibility of being in the room all the time. And you can choose which parts of it apply to you, don't apply to you. I mean, I'm not sure what membership would give you in addition that you don't already have the ability to do.
I think some of the argument is that we need to be the high table where the rules are made. And in a sense,
always, for me, these are status goals, right? If you want status, please go ahead, waste your time doing these things. I think we should be chasing outcomes. Outcomes means, can we cooperate? Can we get what we need for our nuclear program? Can we work with other people? Yes, we can. Nothing stops us today. It's perfectly legal, and we should do that. And I think we, at our stage of development and power, should actually be concentrating on the outcomes rather than, I want glory, I want status, I want other people to recognize me. I mean, why? This is India. You don't need other people's certificate.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Has the nuclear deal, in a sense, we've seen efforts by Pakistan also to try and get a similar deal for itself. You think something of this kind is feasible, perhaps, maybe not with Pakistan, maybe with other countries? Has that kind of set up a model, in a sense, for other countries?
It's been 15 years and nobody else has got it.
Yeah.
Which suggests that India is, in a sense, unique.
Yeah.
And was dealt with also as a unique exception. So I don't think so. I would be surprised if anybody else actually was treated the same way.
The deal that Pakistan has with China for nuclear reactors, is there something on the similar lines?
Well, Pakistan's initial deal in 1975, actually, when Bhutto agreed with Mao Zedong to get nuclear help, was actually help for their nuclear weapons program. And their cooperation was really on the nuclear weapons side, on the missiles, for what they call the defense of Pakistan. But I think That's where their cooperation started. So that was a very different deal. That was a strategic investment by China in a neighbor. And it's really unprecedented to see that kind of relationship in a sensitive field, a nuclear weapon state, making another one a nuclear weapon state, providing the material, the technology, reportedly even testing the weapon for them in the early 90s in Xinjiang. That kind of relationship is very rare. And then when AQ Khan was busy proliferating and working with North Korea and so on, much of it was through China. So, and I don't think all the truth about what happened has ever come out.
Yeah.
Ever come out. But certainly that part of the China-Pakistan relationship, that nuclear relationship, and China's attempt to keep Pakistan at least one step behind India all the time in terms of this capability, strategic capability. I think is something really unique. And that has nothing to do with our nuclear deal. Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, don't forget, started long before, ours.
Yeah.
And
so you would say
to turn a blind eye to that through the 80s because of the war in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So, Pakistan, it was a clandestine program. It was illegal. It wasn't based on any deals, quite unlike ours. And it depended on large, powerful patrons supporting it or turning a blind eye and permitting it to happen.
So you would say that the deal still has relevance even today? It forms the foundation of our relationship with the US?
I think that the deal has made our present relationship possible. And because of that, we are where we are today. I mean, in other words, we built on it, and now we have a much bigger relationship with the US. But I think it was a transformative moment, not only in terms of what we actually did together with the US, but also in terms of perception in India and in the US, that we could work together as partners to solve a difficult problem. And I think that is why it attracted so much public attention in both countries. There was obviously, how there was lots of political argument in India about the deal. We actually, there was a vote in parliament even. But right through that process, all the polls showed us that more than 90% of the Indian population supported the deal. And I think there was a lesson there for the political class, for the chattering classes, for the politicians, that the Indian people were actually way ahead of the politicians and all of us who are professionally interested in foreign policy. The Indian people saw the relationship with the US as being in India's interest and supported the deal as such. And I think that's what actually sustained the deal. When there were periods when, there was a fair amount of public criticism and so on, and it seemed hard. And I think that's why even when those who criticized the deal politically in 2007, 2008, when they came to power, 2014, they became the biggest supporters of the deal.
Yeah.
Because it is in India's interest. And if you're responsible for India's foreign policy, defense, etc., I think you will support the deal. So to that extent, yes, I think it's an important deal. What it did for public awareness, consciousness, for the India-US relationship, I think was quite significant.
Ambassador Menon, on that note, thank you for your perspective. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you, Surya. Good to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you.